The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Braxton as Second Lieutenant Sarah Chun stepped out of her quarters. Her crisp uniform bearing the fresh creases of someone who had spent an hour getting every detail perfect. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted from the mess hall, mixing with the distinct odor of diesel fuel and the metallic scent that seemed to cling to every military installation. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building in her stomach since she received her assignment orders 3 weeks ago. Fort Braxton was known throughout the Army as one of the most challenging postings for new officers. It wasn't just the intense training programs or the demanding physical requirements that made it notorious. It was Colonel Marcus Sterling, the base commander who had earned a reputation for breaking promising young officers who couldn't meet his impossibly high standards. Sarah had heard the stories during her time at West Point, whispered conversations in the barracks about the colonel who seemed to take personal pleasure in finding the weakest link in every unit and exploiting it until that person either rose to meet his expectations or requested a transfer. Walking toward the administration building for her first briefing, Sarah's mind wandered back to the conversation she'd had with her father just 2 days ago. General William Chun had been one of the most respected officers in the Army before his retirement, and his advice had always been something Sarah treasured. But this time, his words had carried a weight that made her uncomfortable. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about Colonel Sterling," her father had said, his voice carrying that serious tone he used when discussing matters of life and death. "He's not like other commanders you'll encounter. Sterling has a way of getting under people's skin, of finding exactly what motivates them, and then using that knowledge to push them beyond what they think they're capable of. Some officers come out of his command stronger than they ever imagined possible. Others," he had paused, looking out the window of their family home, "others never recover from the experience." The administration building loomed ahead, a 3-story brick structure that had been built during World War II and renovated countless times since then. The American flag snapped in the morning breeze above the entrance, and Sarah could see other officers moving purposefully through the corridors visible through the large windows. She paused at the entrance, checking her reflection in the glass doors one final time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was immaculate, and her posture spoke of the confidence that had carried her through 4 years at West Point and 6 months of advanced training. Inside the building, the atmosphere was businesslike and efficient. Sergeants and junior officers moved through the hallways with the kind of purposeful energy that spoke of a well-run organization. Sarah found the reception desk and identified herself to the staff sergeant behind it, a woman whose nameplate read Martinez and whose eyes held the knowing look of someone who had seen countless new officers pass through these doors. "Lieutenant Chun, reporting for duty," Sarah said, offering her orders. Sergeant Martinez reviewed the paperwork with practiced efficiency, her eyes flicking between the documents and Sarah's face. "Welcome to Fort Braxton, Lieutenant. The colonel is expecting you in conference room B in 15 minutes. Take the elevator to the 2nd floor, turn left, 3rd door on your right." She paused, and something in her expression shifted slightly. "A word of advice, ma'am. The colonel appreciates directness and attention to detail. He doesn't have patience for excuses or explanations that aren't based on facts." Sarah nodded her thanks and made her way to the elevator. The advice seemed standard enough, but there was something in Sergeant Martinez's tone that suggested there was more to the story. As the elevator rose to the 2nd floor, Sarah found herself thinking about all the preparation she had done for this assignment. She had studied every manual, memorized every regulation, and spent countless hours in physical training to ensure she would be ready for whatever challenges Colonel Sterling might present. The 2nd floor corridor was lined with photographs showing the history of Fort Braxton, from its establishment during World War II through various conflicts and peacetime operations. Sarah paused briefly to examine a photo from the Iraq War, showing a group of officers standing beside an armored vehicle. In the center of the group, she recognized a younger version of Colonel Sterling, his jaw set in the same determined expression she had seen in more recent photographs. Conference Room B was exactly where Sergeant Martinez had indicated, and Sarah arrived with 3 minutes to spare. She knocked on the door and heard a voice call for her to enter. Inside, She found a spacious room with a long conference table surrounded by chairs. Maps covered one wall, showing various military installations and training areas. At the head of the table sat Colonel Marcus Sterling. The first thing Sarah noticed about the colonel was how completely his presence dominated the room. He was not an exceptionally large man, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a build that spoke of someone who maintained military fitness standards well into his 40s. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way his pale blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of her appearance in the space of a heartbeat, that made Sarah understand immediately why he had such a reputation. "Lieutenant Chun," Colonel Sterling said, rising from his chair. His voice was clear and carried easily across the room without being particularly loud. "Please have a seat." Sarah moved to the chair he indicated and sat down, maintaining the straight posture that had been drilled into her during her years of training. Colonel Sterling resumed his own seat and opened a folder that had been sitting on the table in front of him. "I've reviewed your file," he said, his eyes moving between the paperwork and Sarah's face. "Graduated in the top 15% of your class at West Point, excellent physical fitness scores, commendable performance during advanced training. Your instructors speak highly of your tactical thinking and leadership potential." He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what do you think qualifies you to serve at Fort Braxton?" The question was straightforward enough, but Sarah sensed there was more to it than appeared on the surface. She had prepared for this kind of inquiry, but something about the colonel's direct gaze made her reconsider the standard responses she had rehearsed. "Sir, I believe my training and academic performance demonstrate my commitment to excellence and my ability to meet challenging standards," she began. "I've consistently sought out opportunities to test myself and improve my capabilities, and I'm prepared to contribute to the mission of this installation." Colonel Sterling nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away. "That's a very polished answer, Lieutenant. The kind of response I would expect from someone who graduated near the top of her class at West Point." He paused, tapping his pen against the folder. "But I'm not interested in hearing what you think I want to hear. I'm interested in understanding who you are when the polished responses aren't sufficient." Sarah felt a slight shift in the atmosphere of the room, as though they had moved from the formal introductions to something more substantial. "Sir, I believe I'm someone who doesn't give up when things become difficult. I've found that most challenges can be overcome with enough preparation, dedication, and willingness to learn from mistakes." "Interesting," Colonel Sterling said. "And what makes you think that approach will be sufficient here?" The question caught Sarah slightly off guard. There was something almost challenging in the way he asked it, as though he was testing not just her confidence, but her understanding of what she was walking into. "Sir, I understand that Fort Braxton has a reputation for high standards and demanding training programs. I'm confident that the same principles that have served me well in the past will continue to do so here." Colonel Sterling was quiet for several long moments, his pale eyes studying Sarah's face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been amusement, though his expression remained serious. "Lieutenant Chun, are you familiar with the concept of cognitive bias?" The sudden shift in the conversation surprised Sarah. "Yes, sir. It refers to systematic patterns of thinking that can lead to errors in judgment or decision-making." "Exactly. One of the most common cognitive biases is the assumption that past success predicts future success, especially when facing new and unfamiliar challenges." Colonel Sterling leaned forward slightly. "You've been successful in your training and education because you've operated within systems that were designed to be predictable. Study hard, follow the rules, maintain high standards, and you'll succeed. But military leadership in the real world doesn't operate according to the same rules as a classroom or a training exercise." Sarah found herself listening more intently, sensing that this was moving beyond a standard briefing into something more like a lesson. "Sir, I understand that real-world situations are more complex and unpredictable. Understanding that intellectually and truly comprehending it are two very different things," Colonel Sterling replied. "Here at Fort Braxton, we specialize in placing officers in situations where their previous experience and training may not provide clear answers. We're interested in discovering how people think and react when the familiar tools don't work. The conversation was taking on a tone that Sarah hadn't expected. She had prepared for questions about her qualifications and her goals, but this felt more like a philosophical discussion about the nature of leadership and problem solving. She decided to take a more direct approach. "Sir, what specifically should I expect during my assignment here?" Colonel Sterling smiled for the first time since she had entered the room, though it was not a particularly warm expression. "I appreciate the direct question, Lieutenant. What you should expect is to have your assumptions challenged on a regular basis. You should expect to encounter problems that don't have textbook solutions and situations where your previous training may actually work against you. Most importantly, you should expect to discover things about yourself that you didn't know existed." He stood up and walked to the wall covered with maps, gesturing for Sarah to join him. "Your first assignment will be to work with Captain Rodriguez in planning and executing a series of training exercises for junior enlisted personnel. The exercises are designed to test problem-solving abilities under stress, but they also serve as an evaluation tool for the officers who design and implement them." Sarah studied the map he was indicating, noting the various training areas marked with different symbols and notations. "What kind of timeline are we working with, sir?" "The first exercise is scheduled for next week. Captain Rodriguez has the basic framework prepared, but the specific scenarios and objectives will be your responsibility. You'll have 5 days to develop a comprehensive plan that meets the training objectives while providing meaningful challenges for the participants." Colonel Sterling turned to face her directly. "I should mention that the scenarios you develop will also be evaluated by a panel that includes several senior officers. Their assessment will become part of your permanent record." The information was delivered in a matter-of-fact tone, but Sarah sensed that this was more significant than a routine training assignment. "Sir, will I have access to previous exercise plans or examples to use as reference material?" "No," Colonel Sterling said simply. "Part of the evaluation process involves assessing your ability to develop original solutions rather than modifying existing approaches. You'll have access to the standard regulations and safety protocols, but the creative and strategic elements will be entirely your responsibility." Sarah felt a familiar surge of nervous energy, the same sensation she had experienced before major exams or challenging physical tests during her training. But alongside the nervousness was something else, a sense of excitement at the prospect of tackling a problem that would require her to think beyond the standard approaches she had learned. "I understand, sir. I'll begin working with Captain Rodriguez immediately." Colonel Sterling returned to his seat and opened another folder. "Before you go, Lieutenant, I want you to understand something about the culture here at Fort Braxton. Excellence is not just expected, it's assumed. The officers who succeed here are those who can consistently perform at a high level while also demonstrating the kind of innovative thinking that will serve them well in leadership positions. The officers who struggle are usually those who rely too heavily on following established procedures without understanding the principles behind them." He handed her a set of documents that appeared to include maps, regulations, and contact information. "These materials will give you the basic information you need to get started. Captain Rodriguez is expecting you at 1,400 hours in Building 7. I suggest you spend the intervening time familiarizing yourself with the training facilities and thinking about what you want to accomplish." Sarah accepted the documents and stood up, recognizing that the briefing was coming to an end. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the guidance, and I'm looking forward to the challenge." Colonel Sterling's pale eyes studied her face for a moment before he nodded. "We'll see, Lieutenant." Dismissed. As Sarah left the conference room and made her way back through the corridors of the administration building, she found herself thinking about the conversation in a way that was both uncomfortable and energizing. Colonel Sterling had managed to convey a great deal of information without actually telling her very much about what to expect. His comments about cognitive bias and the limitations of previous success had clearly been intended to make her question her own assumptions, and she had to admit that the approach was effective. Outside, the morning sun had given way to a partly cloudy sky, and the temperature was beginning to rise toward what promised to be a warm afternoon. Sarah decided to use the time before her meeting with Captain Rodriguez to explore the base and get a better understanding of the facilities she would be working with. The documents Colonel Sterling had given her included a detailed map of Fort Braxton, and she was surprised by the size and complexity of the installation. Walking through the various sections of the base, Sarah began to appreciate the scope of the training programs conducted there. She passed several groups of enlisted personnel engaged in different types of exercises, from basic physical fitness training to what appeared to be advanced tactical simulations. The level of intensity and focus was impressive, and she could see why Fort Braxton had developed its reputation as a place where serious military training took place. In one area, she observed a group of soldiers working through what appeared to be a complex problem-solving exercise involving the assembly and operation of communications equipment under simulated combat conditions. The soldiers were clearly under stress, sweat visible on their faces despite the moderate temperature, but they were working together efficiently and communicating effectively. Watching them, Sarah found herself wondering what kind of training scenario she would be designing and whether she would be able to create challenges that were both meaningful and achievable. As she continued her exploration, Sarah encountered other officers who were clearly engaged in supervisory or instructional roles. Most of them acknowledged her with professional courtesy, but she noticed that several seemed to study her with particular interest when they realized she was new to the base. The attention wasn't necessarily unfriendly, but it carried a quality of evaluation that made Sarah suspect that news of her arrival and her assignment had already circulated through the officer corps. Building 7 turned out to be a modern structure that housed the tactical training offices and several conference rooms equipped with advanced planning and simulation equipment. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early for her appointment with Captain Rodriguez, partly out of habit and partly because she wanted to have a few extra minutes to gather her thoughts before diving into what she suspected would be a complex planning process. Captain Elena Rodriguez turned out to be a woman in her early 30s with the kind of competent, no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah had come to associate with experienced military officers. Her office was organized and efficient, with maps, charts, and training manuals arranged in a way that spoke of someone who took her responsibility seriously, but also understood the importance of being able to find information quickly when needed. "Lieutenant Shun, welcome to Fort Braxton," Captain Rodriguez said, rising from her desk and extending her hand. "I trust your briefing with the colonel went well?" "Yes, ma'am. He provided me with some background information and explained the general parameters of the assignment." Captain Rodriguez smiled, and Sarah detected a hint of sympathy in her expression. "The colonel's briefings can be intense. He has a way of making you think about things from perspectives you might not have considered before. But I think you'll find that the challenging aspects of working here are also what make it so rewarding." She gestured for Sarah to take a seat and pulled out a thick folder that appeared to contain detailed planning documents. "Let me give you some context about what we're trying to accomplish with these training exercises. The goal is not just to test the enlisted personnel's abilities, but to create scenarios that will help them develop problem-solving skills they can apply in real-world situations. That means we need exercises that are realistic enough to be relevant, but complex enough to require genuine creative thinking." Sarah opened her notebook and began taking notes as Captain Rodriguez explained the framework that had already been established. The training exercises would involve groups of 8 to 12 enlisted personnel working together to accomplish objectives that would require them to use a combination of technical skills, tactical thinking, and interpersonal cooperation. The scenarios would be set up to include unexpected complications and resource limitations that would force the participants to adapt their approaches as they work through the problems. "The challenging part," Captain Rodriguez continued, "is creating scenarios that are neither too easy nor impossibly difficult. We want the participants to experience real stress and uncertainty, but we also want them to have a genuine opportunity to succeed if they approach the problems thoughtfully and work together effectively." As they talked through the various components of the training program, Sarah began to understand why Colonel Sterling had emphasized the importance of original thinking. The scenarios would need to be complex enough to engage participants who had already completed basic training and had some experience with standard military procedures. At the same time, they would need to be different enough from routine training exercises to force people out of their comfort zones and require them to think creatively. What kind of evaluation criteria will we be using to assess both the participants and the exercise design? Sarah asked. That's one of the most important aspects of the program, Captain Rodriguez replied. The enlisted personnel will be evaluated on their problem-solving process as much as their final results. We're looking for evidence of creative thinking, effective communication, and the ability to adapt when initial approaches don't work. But you and I will also be evaluated on how well our exercise design accomplishes those objectives. The implications of that statement were significant, and Sarah realized that her performance on this assignment would be scrutinized not just by Captain Rodriguez and Colonel Sterling, but by the panel of senior officers that the colonel had mentioned. The exercise she designed would need to be sophisticated enough to challenge experienced soldiers, while also demonstrating her own understanding of effective training methodologies and leadership principles. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing the available facilities, equipment, and resources that would be available for the training exercises. Sarah was impressed by the range of options, from basic communication and navigation equipment to more advanced simulation tools that could create realistic but controlled representations of various types of operational environments. The challenge would be selecting and combining these resources in ways that would create meaningful learning experiences. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself developing a growing appreciation for the complexity of what she had undertaken. This was clearly more than a simple training assignment. It was an opportunity to demonstrate her ability to think strategically about military education and leadership development. At the same time, she was beginning to understand why Colonel Sterling had such a reputation for challenging officers. The assignment was structured in a way that would require her to go well beyond the standard approaches she had learned during her own training. By the time her meeting with Captain Rodriguez concluded, Sarah had a clear understanding of the timeline, resources, and evaluation criteria for the project. She also had a growing sense of both excitement and apprehension about what lay ahead. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had hoped to encounter as a new officer, but she was also beginning to appreciate why some people found Colonel Sterling's methods intimidating. Walking back to her quarters as the sun began to set over Fort Braxton, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with her father before reporting for duty. His warning about Colonel Sterling's methods had seemed abstract at the time, but now she was beginning to understand what he meant about the colonel's ability to push people beyond their comfort zones. The assignment she had been given was clearly designed to test not just her technical competence, but her ability to think independently and creatively under pressure. That evening, as Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the materials Captain Rodriguez had given her and beginning to sketch out preliminary ideas for the training exercise, she found herself thinking about the broader implications of her situation. This assignment was clearly more than just another step in her professional development. It was a test of her potential as a military leader and her ability to thrive in an environment where standard approaches might not be sufficient. The challenge ahead would require her to draw on everything she had learned during her training while also pushing beyond those boundaries to develop something genuinely original and effective. As she worked late into the evening, Sarah found herself looking forward to the opportunity to prove that she could meet Colonel Sterling's standards and demonstrate the kind of innovative thinking that would set her apart as an officer. But alongside the excitement was a growing awareness of the pressure she was under. Colonel Sterling had made it clear that failure would not be taken lightly, and Sarah knew that her performance on this first assignment would likely influence how she was perceived and what opportunities would be available to her in the future. The stakes were higher than anything she had encountered during her training, and she was determined to rise to the challenge. #Under Fire the next morning brought an unexpected change in plans that would set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah arrived at Building 7 at 0700 hours, planning to spend the day developing detailed scenarios for the training exercise, when she found Captain Rodriguez waiting for her with a grim expression and a stack of revised orders. "Lieutenant Shun, we have a situation," Captain Rodriguez said without preamble. "The timeline for your training exercise has been moved up significantly. Instead of having 5 days to prepare, you now have exactly 48 hours before the first scenario needs to be executed." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed the information. 2 days to develop, test, and refine a training exercise that was supposed to demonstrate her capabilities as an officer and serve as a meaningful learning experience for enlisted personnel. Ma'am, may I ask what caused the change in timeline? Colonel Sterling received orders yesterday evening that require him to deploy several senior officers for an inspection at another installation next week. Rather than postpone your exercise, he's decided to accelerate the schedule so that the evaluation panel can observe your work before they leave. Captain Rodriguez handed Sarah a folder containing what appeared to be additional constraints and requirements. He also asked me to inform you that the scope of the exercise has been expanded slightly. Opening the folder, Sarah discovered that what had been planned as a single-day training exercise for one group of enlisted personnel had been changed to a 2-day program involving 3 separate groups working through related but distinct scenarios. Instead of designing one complex problem-solving exercise, she would need to create a comprehensive training program that would challenge participants at different skill levels and evaluate their performance across multiple types of activities. Captain Rodriguez, I need to ask directly, is this type of last-minute change typical for assignments here? Or is this specifically intended as an additional challenge for my evaluation? Captain Rodriguez paused before answering, her expression suggesting that Sarah's question had touched on something significant. Both, Lieutenant. Colonel Sterling believes that the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances is one of the most important qualities an officer can possess. At the same time, he's genuinely interested in seeing how you handle the kind of pressure that you'll face in real operational situations. The honesty of the response was both reassuring and intimidating. Sarah appreciated that Captain Rodriguez was being direct about the nature of the challenge, but she was also beginning to understand that Colonel Sterling's methods involved deliberately creating stressful situations to test how officers responded under pressure. What resources will be available to help me meet the new timeline? You'll have access to the same facilities and equipment we discussed yesterday, and I'll be available to review your plans and provide feedback. However, the actual design and implementation strategy will need to be your work. Captain Rodriguez pulled out another document. You should also know that the evaluation panel now includes 2 additional officers from outside Fort Braxton who specialize in training methodology. Your exercise will be observed not just by local commanders, but by experts who evaluate training programs throughout the Army. Sarah spent the remainder of that first day in a state of intense focus that she had rarely experienced before. The pressure of the shortened timeline, combined with the knowledge that her work would be evaluated by experts from outside the base, created a sense of urgency that pushed her to think more creatively and efficiently than she had during any of her previous training. Working with the maps and facility information Captain Rodriguez had provided, Sarah began to develop a comprehensive plan that would make use of multiple locations around Fort Braxton and require participants to demonstrate a range of skills. The first scenario would focus on basic problem solving and communication under stress, using a simulated equipment failure that would force participants to develop alternative approaches to accomplishing their assigned mission. The second scenario would be more complex, requiring groups to coordinate their activities across different locations while dealing with incomplete information and time pressure. The third scenario would combine elements of the first 2 while adding leadership challenges that would require participants to make decisions about resource allocation and task prioritization under simulated combat conditions. As Sarah worked through the details of each scenario, she found herself constantly thinking about Colonel Sterling's comments regarding cognitive bias and the limitations of relying too heavily on established procedures. She made a deliberate effort to design challenges that would require participants to think beyond standard approaches and develop creative solutions to unfamiliar problems. The first major obstacle came when Sarah discovered that 2 of the facilities she had planned to use were already scheduled for other training activities during her exercise timeframe. Rather than simply requesting schedule changes, she decided to view this as an opportunity to make her scenarios more realistic by incorporating the kind of resource limitations that military personnel frequently encounter in real-world situations. Working late into the evening, Sarah redesigned the affected portions of her exercise to make use of alternative locations and equipment. The process was frustrating and time-consuming, but It also pushed her to think more flexibly about how to accomplish her training objectives. By the time she finally returned to her quarters that night, she had developed a detailed plan that was more complex and challenging than anything she had originally envisioned. The second day brought new challenges that tested her ability to coordinate multiple moving parts while maintaining focus on her primary objectives. Sarah discovered that several pieces of equipment she had planned to use required additional safety certifications that would take longer to obtain than her compressed timeline allowed. Rather than abandoning those elements of her exercise, she spent the morning identifying alternative approaches that would accomplish the same training goals using different methods. The experience of constantly adapting her plans to accommodate unexpected constraints was exhausting, but it was also educational in ways that Sarah hadn't anticipated. She was beginning to understand that effective military leadership involved much more than following established procedures. It required the ability to think creatively and maintain focus on objectives, even when the means of achieving those objectives had to be constantly adjusted. By midday, Sarah had developed what she believed was a comprehensive and challenging training program that would meet the objectives outlined by Captain Rodriguez while demonstrating her own capabilities as an innovative officer. She scheduled a review meeting with Captain Rodriguez to get feedback on her plans before the final preparations began. The review meeting revealed both strengths and weaknesses in Sarah's approach that she hadn't recognized on her own. Captain Rodriguez praised the creativity and complexity of the scenarios Sarah had designed, noting that they incorporated realistic challenges that would require genuine problem-solving rather than simple execution of standard procedures. However, she also identified several logistical issues that could create safety concerns or interfere with the educational effectiveness of the exercises. The scenarios you've designed are excellent, Lieutenant, but you need to think more carefully about how you'll manage the transitions between different phases of each exercise, Captain Rodriguez explained. When participants are under stress and focused on solving problems, they may not be fully aware of their surroundings or potential safety hazards. Your role as the exercise controller will be to maintain oversight of the overall situation while allowing the participants enough freedom to develop their own approaches. Sarah spent the afternoon revising her plans to incorporate Captain Rodriguez's feedback, adding detailed safety protocols and communication procedures that would allow her to maintain control over the exercises without interfering with the learning process. The additional complexity was challenging to manage within her limited time frame, but she was beginning to appreciate the importance of considering all aspects of a training program, not just the primary learning objectives. The evening before the exercise was scheduled to begin, Sarah received an unexpected summons to report to Colonel Sterling's office. She had been hoping to spend the time making final preparations and reviewing her plans one more time, but the Colonel's request left no room for delay. Colonel Sterling's office was larger and more formal than the conference room where their first meeting had taken place. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs from various military operations, and maps showing deployments and training exercises from around the world. Behind his desk hung a large photograph showing a group of officers standing in front of what appeared to be a military academy, and Sarah recognized Colonel Sterling among the younger faces in the image. "Lieutenant Shun, please have a seat," Colonel Sterling said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly in front of his desk. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow's exercise begins." Sarah settled into the chair, tried to read the Colonel's expression and tone for clues about what to expect from the conversation. His demeanor was serious, but not hostile, though she sensed that this meeting was about more than routine pre-exercise coordination. "I've reviewed the exercise plans you developed with Captain Rodriguez, and I'm impressed by the creativity and complexity of what you've designed," Colonel Sterling began. "The scenarios are well thought out, the objectives are clear, and you've demonstrated good judgment in adapting to the various constraints and challenges that arose during your preparation." The positive feedback was encouraging, but Sarah sensed that there was more to the conversation than simple praise for her planning efforts. However, Colonel Sterling continued, "I want you to understand that tomorrow's exercise is about much more than testing the enlisted personnel's problem-solving abilities. It's also an opportunity for me to observe how you handle yourself in a leadership role when things don't go according to plan." Sarah felt her attention sharpen as she realized that the colonel was providing her with information about what to expect that went beyond the standard briefing materials she had received. "Sir, are you suggesting that the exercise won't proceed as planned?" Colonel Sterling smiled slightly, though his expression remained serious. "I'm suggesting that military operations rarely proceed exactly as planned, and effective officers need to be able to adapt their leadership approach when circumstances change unexpectedly. Tomorrow's exercise will include several complications that aren't part of your written scenario." The information was both helpful and concerning. Sarah appreciated the advance warning, but she was also beginning to understand that her evaluation would be based not just on the quality of her preparation, but on her ability to maintain effective leadership when faced with unforeseen challenges. "What kind of complications should I expect, sir?" "If I told you that, Lieutenant, it wouldn't be a realistic test of your adaptability," Colonel Sterling replied. "What I will tell you is that effective exercise controllers need to maintain situational awareness at all levels. You need to be monitoring the safety and performance of your participants while also staying alert to broader factors that might affect the success of the training program." Colonel Sterling stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground, where Sarah could see groups of soldiers engaged in evening physical training. "Lieutenant Chun, are you familiar with the concept of stress inoculation?" "Yes, sir. It refers to training people to perform effectively under stressful conditions by gradually exposing them to increasing levels of pressure and uncertainty." "Exactly. The theory is that individuals who have experience dealing with stress in controlled environments will be better prepared to handle stress in real-world situations." He turned back to face her. "Tomorrow's exercise is designed to provide stress inoculation not just for the enlisted personnel, but for you as well." Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement as she began to understand the full scope of what she would be facing. This was clearly much more than a routine training assignment. It was a comprehensive evaluation of her potential as a military leader under conditions that would test her abilities in ways that classroom instruction never could. "Sir, I appreciate the advance warning, and I'm prepared to adapt to whatever challenges arise during the exercise." "I hope so, Lieutenant. But preparation and actual performance under stress are two different things. Tomorrow will provide us with valuable information about which category you fall into." Colonel Sterling returned to his seat behind the desk. "There's one more thing you should understand about tomorrow's exercise. The enlisted personnel participating in your scenarios are all volunteers who specifically requested to be included in challenging training programs. They're expecting to be pushed beyond their comfort zones, and they're prepared to work hard to meet whatever challenges you present to them." This information changed Sarah's perspective on the exercise in an important way. Knowing that the participants were motivated volunteers rather than randomly assigned personnel meant that she could design challenges that were genuinely demanding without worrying about encountering resistance or lack of effort. "That's very helpful to know, sir. It will allow me to focus on creating meaningful learning experiences rather than dealing with motivation issues." "Exactly. These soldiers want to be challenged, and they want to learn from the experience. Your job is to provide them with opportunities to discover capabilities they didn't know they had while also demonstrating your own ability to lead effectively under pressure." Colonel Sterling opened a folder on his desk and reviewed what appeared to be Sarah's personnel file. "Your record suggests that you have the potential to be an excellent officer, Lieutenant. Tomorrow's exercise will help us determine whether that potential can be realized under the kind of conditions you'll face in actual military operations." As Sarah left Colonel Sterling's office and returned to her quarters to make final preparations for the next day, she found herself thinking about the conversation in ways that were both concerning and energizing. The colonel had made it clear that the exercise would involve unexpected challenges and complications, but he had also expressed confidence in her abilities and provided her with useful information about what to expect from the participants. That evening, Sarah spent several hours reviewing her exercise plans and thinking through various contingencies that might arise. She couldn't predict exactly what complications Colonel Sterling had in mind, but she could prepare herself mentally for the need to adapt quickly and maintain focus on her primary objectives, even when circumstances changed unexpectedly. The night before the exercise, Sarah found it difficult to sleep despite her exhaustion from the intensive preparation period. Her mind kept working through different scenarios and potential problems, trying to anticipate what might go wrong and how she could respond effectively. The pressure of being evaluated by senior officers was significant, but even more important was her sense of responsibility for providing a meaningful learning experience for the enlisted personnel who had volunteered to participate. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about her father's advice regarding Colonel Sterling's methods. She was beginning to understand what he had meant about the colonel's ability to push people beyond what they thought they were capable of. Tomorrow's exercise would provide her with an opportunity to discover whether she could rise to meet the standards that had made Fort Braxton one of the most respected training installations in the Army. The alarm sounded at 0500 hours, giving Sarah time for a quick breakfast and final equipment check before the exercise began. Walking across the base in the early morning darkness, she could see lights in various buildings indicating that other personnel were also beginning their day early. The anticipation and nervous energy she felt reminded her of the morning of major examinations during her time at West Point, but this felt more significant because the stakes extended beyond her own performance to include the learning experience of the soldiers who would be participating in her exercise. At Building 7, Sarah found Captain Rodriguez and several other officers who would be serving as safety monitors and observers during the day's activities. The atmosphere was professional and focused, with everyone clearly understanding their roles and responsibilities. Captain Rodriguez handed Sarah a radio and reviewed the communication protocols that would be used throughout the exercise. "Remember, Lieutenant, your primary responsibility is to ensure that the exercise accomplishes its training objectives while maintaining safety standards," Captain Rodriguez said. "The observers will be monitoring the participants' performance and your effectiveness as an exercise controller, but you shouldn't let their presence distract you from your primary duties." As the sun began to rise over Fort Braxton, Sarah could see the first group of enlisted personnel arriving at the designated assembly area. They moved with the confident purposefulness of soldiers who were prepared for a challenging day of training, and Sarah felt a surge of responsibility and determination as she realized that the success of the day would depend largely on her ability to provide effective leadership and guidance. The moment had arrived for Sarah to discover whether all of her preparation and planning would be sufficient to meet the standards that Colonel Sterling had established, and whether she possessed the adaptability and leadership skills necessary to succeed when faced with unexpected challenges and complications. As she walked toward the assembly area to begin the exercise, Sarah found herself thinking that this was exactly the kind of test she had hoped to encounter as a new officer, even though the pressure and uncertainty were greater than anything she had previously experienced. The first group of soldiers was already assembled and waiting for their briefing when Sarah approached the assembly area. Looking at their faces, she could see a mixture of anticipation and curiosity that reminded her of her own feelings before major challenges during her training. These soldiers were prepared to work hard and learn from the experience, and Sarah was determined to provide them with training that would be both challenging and educational. As she began to address the group and explain the first scenario they would be working through, Sarah felt a growing sense of confidence and purpose. The intensive preparation period had been exhausting and stressful, but it had also given her a deep understanding of what she was trying to accomplish and how each element of the exercise was designed to contribute to the participants' learning experience. Whatever complications and challenges Colonel Sterling had planned for the day, Sarah was ready to face them with the same determination and creativity that had carried her through the preparation phase. The real test of her capabilities as a military leader was about to begin, and she was prepared to demonstrate that she could meet the high standards that had made Fort Braxton one of the most respected training installations in the Army. The first complication arose exactly 30 minutes into the initial scenario, just as the first group of soldiers was beginning to work through the simulated equipment failure that formed the core of Sarah's opening exercise. She was monitoring their progress from an observation post that provided a clear view of their work area when Sergeant Martinez approached with a radio message that would change everything about the day ahead. "Lieutenant Shun, I have Colonel Sterling on the radio for you, Sergeant Martinez said, her expression suggesting that this was not routine communication. Sarah accepted the radio, maintaining visual contact with her participants while speaking to the colonel. This is Lieutenant Sean, sir. Lieutenant, we have a situation that requires immediate adjustment to your exercise timeline. Colonel Sterling's voice came through clearly despite some static. A training accident at another facility has resulted in the temporary reassignment of several medical personnel who were designated as safety monitors for your exercise. You'll need to modify your scenarios to account for reduced medical coverage. The implications of this information hit Sarah immediately. The more complex scenarios she had planned for the second and third groups required safety monitors with advanced medical training because they involved physical challenges that carried higher risks of injury. Without adequate medical coverage, she would need to either cancel those portions of the exercise or find ways to maintain training value while reducing risk levels. Sir, what level of medical coverage will be available? You'll have one medic instead of the 3 that were originally assigned, and that individual will need to be shared across all activities rather than dedicated to specific scenarios. Colonel Sterling's tone remained matter-of-fact, but Sarah could sense that this was exactly the kind of adaptation challenge he had warned her about. The evaluation panel is still planning to observe all scheduled activities, so you'll need to find ways to maintain the training value while working within the new constraints. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of the changed situation. The second scenario involved a navigation and communication exercise that required groups to work in different locations across the base, making it impossible for a single medic to provide adequate coverage. The third scenario included physical challenges that specifically required medical personnel with advanced trauma training. Understood, sir. I'll modify the scenarios to accommodate the reduced medical coverage. Lieutenant, I want to be clear about something, Colonel Sterling continued. This is not a request to reduce the challenge level or educational value of your exercise. This is an opportunity for you to demonstrate the kind of creative problem-solving that military leaders need when operational requirements change unexpectedly. The evaluation panel will be assessing how well you adapt to these new constraints while maintaining focus on your training objectives. After Colonel Sterling signed off, Sarah found herself facing exactly the kind of high-pressure decision-making situation that she had been warned to expect. She had approximately 15 minutes before the first group completed their current scenario and needed to transition to the next phase of the exercise. During that time, she would need to completely redesign 2 major components of her training program while ensuring that the participants received a valuable learning experience. Captain Rodriguez joined Sarah at the observation post, having monitored the radio conversation. What's your initial assessment of the situation, Lieutenant? Ma'am, I need to modify scenarios 2 and 3 to eliminate activities that require dedicated medical coverage while maintaining the problem-solving and leadership challenges that were central to the original design. Sarah pulled out her planning notes and began sketching modifications. I think I can accomplish this by consolidating the activities into a single location and replacing some of the physical challenges with decision-making exercises that create similar stress levels. That sounds like a reasonable approach, but you'll need to brief the changes to the safety monitors and observers before the next group begins, Captain Rodriguez replied. You'll also need to ensure that the modified scenarios still provide meaningful evaluation opportunities for the assessment panel. Sarah spent the next 10 minutes in intense focus, redesigning major portions of her exercise while simultaneously monitoring the progress of the first group. The process required her to think quickly and creatively about how to maintain training value while working within significantly different constraints than those she had planned for. The solution she developed involved combining elements of the second and third scenarios into a single complex exercise that would require all participants to work together in solving a multi-layered problem that involved technical skills, communication, and leadership decision-making. Instead of spreading activities across multiple locations, the modified scenario would take place in a single area where one medic could provide adequate safety coverage. When the first group completed their initial scenario, Sarah gathered all participants and observers to brief the changes to the day's schedule. She explained that the modification was designed to create additional challenges that would test their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, which was a critical skill in actual military operations. The scenario you're about to begin involves a simulated command post that has lost most of its communication capability while dealing with multiple ongoing situations that require coordination and decision-making, Sarah announced to the assembled soldiers. Your task will be to establish alternative communication methods, prioritize the various situations based on available information, and develop action plans that make effective use of your resources and capabilities. What Sarah didn't mention was that she was essentially conducting the same type of adaptive problem-solving exercise for herself, working through a complex challenge while being observed and evaluated by senior officers who were specifically looking for evidence of creative thinking and effective leadership under pressure. The modified scenario proved to be more challenging and educational than the original plan had been. By combining elements from multiple exercises into a single complex problem, Sarah had inadvertently created a training experience that required participants to demonstrate a broader range of skills and work together more closely than the original design would have required. Watching the soldiers work through the modified exercise, Sarah found herself gaining new insights into effective training design. The pressure of having to adapt quickly to changed circumstances had pushed her to think more holistically about the relationships between different types of challenges and learning objectives. However, the stress of constantly adapting her plans while maintaining oversight of the exercise was beginning to take a toll. Sarah found herself monitoring multiple streams of information simultaneously. The participants' progress through the scenario, the safety considerations that required constant attention, the reactions of the evaluation panel, and her own performance as exercise controller. The second major complication arose during the afternoon, when the third group was beginning their portion of the modified scenario. Sarah received word that one of the key pieces of equipment they were using had developed a malfunction that created potential safety concerns. Rather than being a planned part of the exercise, this was a genuine equipment failure that required immediate attention. The malfunction involved the communication system that was central to the scenario the participants were working through. Sarah faced a choice between stopping the exercise to address the equipment problem or finding ways to incorporate the malfunction into the training scenario in a way that would maintain both safety and educational value. After quickly assessing the situation and consulting with the available safety monitor, Sarah made the decision to treat the equipment failure as an additional element of the scenario. She briefed the participants that they were now dealing with a complete communication system failure and would need to develop alternative approaches to coordination and information sharing. The decision proved to be inspired, as it created exactly the kind of realistic pressure and uncertainty that military personnel frequently encounter in actual operations. The participants rose to the challenge, demonstrating creativity and teamwork that exceeded what Sarah had observed during the earlier, more structured portions of the exercise. But the constant need to adapt and make decisions under pressure was pushing Sarah to her limits. She had been operating at maximum focus and intensity for nearly 8 hours, constantly balancing multiple priorities while being observed by evaluators who were specifically looking for any signs of weakness or poor judgment. The breaking point came during the final phase of the exercise, when Sarah received a radio call informing her that one of the participants had suffered what appeared to be a minor injury during the problem-solving exercise. The injury was not serious, but it required immediate attention from the medic and temporarily disrupted the scenario that was nearing completion. As Sarah coordinated the medical response, while simultaneously managing the other participants and maintaining communication with the evaluation panel, she felt the accumulated stress and fatigue of the day reaching a critical level. For the first time since the exercise had begun, she experienced a moment of doubt about her ability to handle all of the demands being placed on her. The moment of uncertainty lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Sarah to realize that she was approaching the limits of her current capabilities. Rather than allowing the stress to overwhelm her, she made a conscious decision to focus on the most essential priorities and delegate other responsibilities to Captain Rodriguez and the safety monitors. The decision to acknowledge her limitations and asked for assistance turned out to be exactly the kind of mature leadership judgment that the evaluation panel was looking for. Rather than trying to handle everything herself and risking mistakes or oversights, Sarah demonstrated the wisdom to recognize when delegation was necessary and the confidence to make that choice even while being evaluated. The injured participant turned out to have only a minor cut that required basic first aid, and the exercise was able to continue with minimal disruption. But the incident had provided Sarah with important insights into the realities of leadership under pressure and the importance of maintaining situational awareness even when dealing with multiple competing demands. As the final group completed their modified scenario and the formal exercise period came to an end, Sarah felt a profound sense of exhaustion that went beyond simple physical fatigue. The day had required her to operate at peak mental and emotional intensity for extended periods while constantly adapting to changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. During the debriefing session that followed the exercise, the evaluation panel asked Sarah to discuss her decision-making process during the various complications that had arisen throughout the day. She found herself explaining not just what she had done, but why she had made specific choices and how she had prioritized competing demands when resources and time were limited. Colonel Sterling participated in the debriefing, asking questions that pushed Sarah to think more deeply about the principles that had guided her actions. His questions were challenging, but not hostile, and Sarah sensed that he was genuinely interested in understanding her thought processes rather than simply looking for errors or weaknesses. Lieutenant Chun, when you realized that the equipment malfunction was genuine rather than part of your planned scenario, what factors influenced your decision to incorporate it into the training exercise rather than stopping to address the problem? Colonel Sterling asked. Sarah thought carefully before responding, recognizing that her answer would reveal important information about her approach to leadership and problem-solving. Sir, I assessed that the malfunction created safety concerns, but not immediate dangers, and that addressing it as part of the scenario would provide the participants with exactly the kind of realistic challenge that the exercise was designed to create. I also considered that stopping the exercise would have meant losing the learning opportunity without providing significant safety benefits. And when the participant was injured, why did you decide to delegate coordination responsibilities rather than maintaining direct control over all aspects of the situation? Sir, I realized that trying to handle the medical situation, manage the other participants, and coordinate with observers simultaneously was beyond my current capacity to do effectively. I determined that delegating some responsibilities would result in better overall outcomes than trying to control everything myself. Colonel Sterling nodded thoughtfully before asking his final question. What did you learn about yourself during today's exercise that you didn't know before? The question caught Sarah off guard, as it required her to reflect on personal insights rather than operational decisions. After considering for a moment, she replied, Sir, I learned that my ability to think creatively and adapt to changing circumstances is better than I had expected, but I also learned that recognizing my own limitations and asking for help when necessary is a critical leadership skill that I need to continue developing. The debriefing session continued for another 30 minutes, with various members of the evaluation panel asking questions about specific aspects of the exercise design, implementation, and adaptation. Sarah found the process challenging but educational, as the questions pushed her to articulate the reasoning behind decisions she had made quickly under pressure. When the formal debriefing concluded, Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah as the evaluation panel departed. How do you feel about how the day went, Lieutenant? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. Ma'am, I feel like I learned an enormous amount about leadership under pressure, but I also feel like I made several mistakes that I need to think about and learn from. That's exactly the kind of honest self-assessment that suggests you got the most important lessons from today's experience, Captain Rodriguez replied. The exercises here aren't designed to be easy or comfortable. They're designed to push officers beyond their comfort zones so they can discover capabilities they didn't know they had. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she found herself reflecting on the day in ways that were both satisfying and humbling. She had successfully adapted to multiple unexpected challenges and had maintained focus on her primary objectives despite considerable pressure and uncertainty. The participants had clearly benefited from the training experience, and the evaluation panel had seemed genuinely interested in her approaches to problem-solving and decision-making. At the same time, Sarah was acutely aware of the moments during the day when she had felt overwhelmed or uncertain about the best course of action. The experience had shown her that effective leadership required not just technical competence and preparation, but also the ability to remain calm and think clearly when circumstances changed rapidly and unexpectedly. The day had also given Sarah new insights into Colonel Sterling's methods and philosophy. Rather than simply creating arbitrary challenges or obstacles, he had designed a training experience that simulated the kind of pressure and uncertainty that military leaders face in actual operations. The complications and adaptations that had seemed so stressful during the exercise were realistic representations of the conditions under which important decisions frequently had to be made. That evening, Sarah spent several hours writing a detailed analysis of the day's events and the lessons she had learned from the experience. The process of documenting her thoughts and insights helped her recognize patterns in her decision-making and identify areas where she could improve her approach to leadership challenges. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with Colonel Sterling the evening before the exercise. His warning about unexpected complications and the need for adaptability had proved to be accurate, but the experience had been more educational and developmental than she had anticipated. Rather than simply being tested on her existing capabilities, she had been pushed to develop new skills and insights through direct experience with realistic challenges. The exhaustion Sarah felt was profound, but it was accompanied by a sense of accomplishment and growth that reminded her of the satisfaction she had experienced after completing major milestones during her training at West Point. The day had required her to operate at the limits of her current capabilities while learning and adapting in real time, and she had discovered reserves of creativity and resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. Looking ahead to the continuation of her assignment at Fort Braxton, Sarah realized that the exercise had been just the beginning of what promised to be a challenging and educational experience. Colonel Sterling's methods were demanding and sometimes uncomfortable, but they were also effective in pushing officers to develop capabilities that would serve them well in actual military leadership positions. The evaluation results wouldn't be available for several days, but Sarah felt confident that she had demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking and leadership potential that the assessment was designed to identify. More importantly, she had gained valuable experience in operating under pressure and making decisions when standard approaches weren't sufficient to address the challenges at hand. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself looking forward to whatever challenges Colonel Sterling might present next, confident that she now had a better understanding of both her own capabilities and the methods that made Fort Braxton such an effective training environment for developing military leaders. 3 months after the training exercise that had tested every aspect of her leadership abilities, Sarah found herself facing a challenge that would dwarf everything she had encountered during her initial assignment at Fort Braxton. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing training reports in her office, now expanded to include oversight responsibilities for 3 separate training programs that had been developed based on the success of her original exercise design. Lieutenant Chun, report to the colonel's office immediately, came the voice of Sergeant Martinez over the intercom, carrying an urgency that suggested this was not routine communication. Sarah made her way to the administration building, noting the unusual level of activity in the corridors. Officers were moving with the kind of purposeful intensity that typically indicated either a major training exercise or actual operational deployment. When she reached Colonel Sterling's office, she found him in conversation with 2 officers she didn't recognize, both wearing the insignia that indicated they were from higher headquarters. "Lieutenant Chun, please join us," Colonel Sterling said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I want you to meet Colonel Williams from 3rd Army and Major Peterson from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They're here to discuss a situation that may require your particular expertise." Sarah took the indicated seat, immediately sensing that this conversation was about something far more significant than routine base operations. Colonel Williams was a tall, distinguished-looking officer whose demeanor suggested considerable experience with complex operational planning. Major Peterson appeared younger, but carried herself with a confident professionalism typical of intelligence professionals. Lieutenant Chun, Colonel Williams began, we understand that you've developed considerable expertise in training design and adaptive leadership methodologies during your time here at Fort Braxton. We have a situation that may require exactly those capabilities, but under circumstances that go well beyond normal training environments. The formal tone and presence of officers from outside the base made it clear that Sarah was being considered for an assignment that would be fundamentally different from anything she had previously encountered. She listened carefully as Colonel Williams outlined a situation that would test everything she had learned during her months of working with Colonel Sterling. We have a joint training exercise scheduled with allied forces from 3 different countries, designed to test multinational coordination and communication protocols, Colonel Williams explained. The exercise was originally planned to be led by a senior officer with extensive international experience. However, that officer has been reassigned to deal with an urgent situation in another theater, leaving us without someone who has the necessary combination of training expertise and adaptability to manage what has become a very complex coordination challenge. Major Peterson opened a folder and pulled out several documents that appeared to contain detailed operational plans. The exercise involves approximately 800 personnel from 4 different military organizations, each with their own procedures, communication protocols, and cultural considerations. The scenarios are designed to simulate joint operations under challenging conditions, but the real challenge will be coordinating the diverse approaches and expectations of the participating units. Sarah began to understand why she was being considered for this assignment, but the scope and complexity of what was being described far exceeded anything she had managed before. Sir, may I ask what specific role you're considering me for in this exercise? Colonel Sterling answered, his expression serious but showing what might have been a hint of pride. Lieutenant, you're being considered to serve as the exercise director, with full responsibility for coordination, implementation, and adaptation of the training scenarios as circumstances require. It would be the most challenging leadership assignment available to an officer of your rank, and it would require you to apply everything you've learned here under conditions that will test your capabilities in ways that go well beyond what you've experienced so far. The magnitude of the opportunity was both exciting and intimidating. Sarah had spent months developing expertise in training design and adaptive leadership, but this assignment would require her to apply those skills while managing cultural differences, language barriers, and the complex politics of international military cooperation. What timeline are we working with? Sarah asked. The exercise is scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, Colonel Williams replied. You would have that time to review the existing plans, coordinate with representatives from the participating units, and adapt the scenarios to account for the various capabilities and limitations of the multinational force. You would also be responsible for training the staff officers who will assist in managing the exercise. Major Peterson handed Sarah a thick folder containing what appeared to be preliminary planning documents. The scenarios involve simulated peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance coordination, and joint combat operations. Each scenario is designed to test different aspects of multinational cooperation, but they will all require real-time adaptation based on how the various units interact and perform together. Sarah opened the folder and began scanning the documents, immediately recognizing the complexity of what was being proposed. The exercise would involve not just different military units, but different approaches to leadership, decision-making, and problem-solving that reflected the various national and organizational cultures represented in the participating forces. Sir, I'm honored to be considered for this assignment, and I believe my experience here has prepared me to handle the adaptive challenges involved, Sarah said. However, I want to be certain that I understand the full scope of what's being asked. Would I have final authority over exercise design and implementation, or would decisions need to be coordinated with representatives from the other participating organizations? Colonel Williams smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. That's exactly the kind of question that suggests you understand the complexity of what's involved. You would have operational authority over exercise execution, but Strategic decisions would need to be made in consultation with a coordination board that includes senior representatives from each participating organization. Your challenge will be maintaining training effectiveness while managing the various political and cultural considerations that will inevitably arise. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah asking detailed questions about resources, support staff, evaluation criteria, and contingency planning for various types of complications that might arise during such a complex international exercise. By the time the meeting concluded, she had a clear understanding of both the enormous opportunity and the significant risks associated with accepting the assignment. "Lieutenant, we need your decision within 48 hours, Colonel Williams said as the meeting concluded. This assignment would accelerate your career development significantly, but it would also place you under the kind of scrutiny and pressure that many officers don't encounter until much later in their careers. You should consider carefully whether you're prepared for that level of responsibility." After Colonel Williams and Major Peterson departed, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Sterling in his office. The atmosphere seemed different from their previous conversations, less formal and more collegial, as though her performance over the past months had earned his respect in ways that changed their professional relationship. "What's your initial reaction to the assignment, Lieutenant?" Colonel Sterling asked. Sarah considered the question carefully, recognizing that her response would reveal important information about her own assessment of her capabilities and readiness for increased responsibility. "Sir, I'm excited by the opportunity and challenged by the complexity of what's involved. At the same time, I'm aware that this assignment would require me to operate well beyond my current experience level and manage types of challenges that I've only encountered in much simpler forms." "That's a mature and accurate assessment," Colonel Sterling replied. "This assignment would definitely push you beyond your comfort zone and require you to develop new capabilities under considerable pressure. But based on what I've observed during your time here, I believe you have the potential to succeed in this kind of environment." Colonel Sterling walked to the window overlooking the parade ground, where Sarah could see various training activities in progress. "Lieutenant, when you first arrived here, I told you that Fort Braxton was designed to help officers discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. This assignment would continue that process, but under conditions where the stakes are much higher and the margin for error much smaller." The weight of the decision was significant, and Sarah found herself thinking not just about the immediate challenges of the assignment, but about the broader trajectory of her military career. Accepting this opportunity would mark a major acceleration in her professional development, but it would also place her under the kind of scrutiny that could either establish her reputation as an exceptional officer or damage her career prospects if she wasn't able to meet the demands of the role. "Sir, may I ask for your honest assessment of whether you think I'm ready for this level of responsibility?" Colonel Sterling turned to face her directly, his expression serious but not discouraging. "Lieutenant, readiness for this kind of assignment isn't about having all the necessary experience and knowledge in advance. It's about having the intellectual capacity, emotional resilience, and adaptive capability to learn and grow while managing complex responsibilities under pressure. Based on what I've observed, you possess those qualities." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully before continuing. "However, I also want you to understand that accepting this assignment will change the trajectory of your career in fundamental ways. Success in this role would mark you as someone capable of handling the most challenging assignments the Army has to offer. But failure would be very public and would limit your opportunities for advancement significantly." Sarah spent the next 24 hours in intensive consideration of the decision, reviewing every aspect of what the assignment would require and honestly assessing her own capabilities and limitations. She sought advice from Captain Rodriguez and several other officers whose judgment she respected, finding that their perspectives helped her think through various aspects of the opportunity that she might not have considered on her own. The decision ultimately came down to Sarah's assessment of whether she was willing to embrace the kind of professional risk that could either accelerate her career dramatically or create significant setbacks if she wasn't able to meet the demands of the role. After careful consideration, she concluded that the opportunity to develop her capabilities under challenging conditions was worth the associated risks. When Sarah informed Colonel Sterling of her decision to accept the assignment, his response surprised her with its combination of satisfaction and something that might have been respect. "Lieutenant, I'm pleased with your decision, and I'm confident that you'll represent Fort Braxton well in this assignment," he said. "But I also want you to know that you'll continue to have my support and guidance as you work through the challenges ahead. This assignment is the beginning of a new phase in your development as an officer, not the end of your connection to the training and mentorship you've received here." The 6 weeks of preparation that followed were among the most intensive and educational of Sarah's military career. Working with representatives from the participating international units, she gained insights into different approaches to military leadership, decision-making, and problem-solving that broadened her understanding of effective leadership in ways that purely American training environments could not have provided. The cultural and organizational differences among the participating units proved to be both challenging and enlightening. Sarah found herself serving not just as an exercise director, but as a cultural translator and diplomatic facilitator, helping units with different backgrounds and approaches find ways to work together effectively toward common objectives. The actual exercise exceeded everyone's expectations in terms of both complexity and educational value. Sarah found herself managing situations that required her to adapt her leadership approach constantly, while maintaining focus on training objectives that were sometimes in tension with the political and cultural considerations of international cooperation. On the final day of the exercise, as Sarah was conducting the comprehensive debriefing session with senior representatives from all participating units, she received word that Colonel Sterling had arrived to observe the conclusion of the exercise. His presence was not entirely unexpected, but seeing him among the international officers who were evaluating her performance added an additional dimension to the significance of the moment. The debriefing session itself went exceptionally well, with representatives from each participating unit expressing appreciation for the quality of the training experience and the effectiveness of Sarah's coordination and leadership throughout the complex exercise. Several of the senior international officers specifically praised her ability to adapt scenarios in real time while maintaining focus on meaningful learning objectives. As the formal debriefing concluded and the various participants began to depart, Colonel Sterling approached Sarah for a private conversation. His demeanor was more serious than she had expected, and she wondered if there had been aspects of her performance that had not met his standards. "Lieutenant Chun, I want to speak with you before you return to Fort Braxton," Colonel Sterling said. "I've spent the past 3 days observing your work and speaking with the senior officers from the participating units. I wanted you to hear directly from me what I've concluded about your performance." Sarah felt a familiar nervousness as she waited for his assessment, recognizing that his evaluation would likely influence not just her immediate future, but the broader trajectory of her military career. "Your performance during this exercise has been exceptional by any standard I might apply," Colonel Sterling continued. "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive leadership, cultural sensitivity, and strategic thinking that the Army needs in officers who will be responsible for complex multinational operations. More importantly, you've shown that you can maintain your principles and effectiveness under pressure while adapting your approach to accommodate considerations that go well beyond purely military factors." The praise was more comprehensive and specific than anything Sarah had expected, and she found herself struggling to process the full implications of what Colonel Sterling was telling her. "Sir, I appreciate your assessment, and I'm grateful for the training and mentorship that made this assignment possible." Colonel Sterling smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, his expression seemed genuinely warm rather than simply professional. "Lieutenant, there's something else I need to tell you. Based on your performance here and the recommendations of the international officers who participated in this exercise, you're being considered for promotion to captain ahead of the normal timeline. Your exceptional performance has earned recognition at levels well above Fort Braxton." The information was stunning, as early promotion was extraordinarily rare and typically reserved for officers who had demonstrated exceptional capabilities under the most challenging circumstances. Sarah felt a mixture of pride, gratitude, and recognition that her professional life was about to change in fundamental ways. Furthermore, Colonel Sterling continued, "You're being considered for assignment to the staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where your expertise in adaptive training design and international cooperation would be applied to some of the most challenging problems facing the military today." As Sarah processed this information, she realized that her time at Fort Braxton had accomplished exactly what Colonel Sterling had suggested it would during their first conversation months ago. She had discovered capabilities she didn't know she possessed, and had developed the kind of leadership skills that would serve her well in the most demanding assignments the Army could offer. The next morning, as Sarah prepared to return to Fort Braxton to begin the transition process for her new assignment, she received an unexpected request to report to Colonel Sterling's temporary office at the exercise site. When she arrived, she found him standing at attention beside his desk, his expression formal, but showing what appeared to be genuine respect. "Lieutenant Chun," Colonel Sterling said, "it has been my privilege to serve as your commanding officer and to observe your development as a military leader. Your performance has exceeded every expectation I had when you first arrived at Fort Braxton." What happened next was something Sarah would remember for the rest of her military career. Colonel Sterling, the officer who had developed a reputation for being one of the most demanding commanders in the Army, rendered a crisp military salute that conveyed not just professional courtesy, but genuine respect and recognition of her achievements. "Sir," Sarah replied, returning the salute with equal precision, "thank you for the training and mentorship that made this success possible." As they concluded the formal ceremony and Colonel Sterling relaxed his posture, Sarah realized that she had experienced something truly remarkable. The officer who had made her initial months at Fort Braxton so challenging and stressful had become not just a mentor, but someone who clearly respected her capabilities and was proud of what she had accomplished. "Lieutenant, I have one final piece of advice for you as you move forward in your career," Colonel Sterling said. "The challenges you'll face in your new assignment will make everything you've experienced here seem simple by comparison. But you now have the tools and experience necessary to succeed in any environment the Army can place you in. Trust your judgment, continue to adapt and learn, and never lose sight of the principles that have carried you this far." The months that followed brought assignments and responsibilities that Sarah could never have imagined when she first reported to Fort Braxton as a nervous second lieutenant. Working at the highest levels of military planning and coordination, she found herself applying the lessons she had learned from Colonel Sterling on a daily basis, adapting to new challenges while maintaining focus on fundamental objectives. But perhaps the most significant outcome of her experience was not the career advancement or the recognition she received for her performance. It was the confidence and perspective she had gained about her own capabilities and her understanding of what effective leadership required under the most challenging circumstances. Years later, as Brigadier General Sarah Chun stood in her own command office, she would often think about the lessons she had learned from Colonel Sterling and the way his demanding methods had pushed her to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The officer who had once seemed determined to make her life miserable had actually provided her with the most valuable education she had ever received about leadership, adaptability, and the importance of maintaining high standards even under pressure. The salute that Colonel Sterling had rendered on that final morning had represented more than simple military courtesy. It had been recognition of a transformation that had occurred through months of challenging training, adaptive thinking, and the development of leadership skills that would serve her well throughout her military career. As she reflected on that pivotal moment, Sarah realized that the true measure of Colonel Sterling's success as a commander was not the difficulty of the challenges he presented, but the way those challenges had prepared her and countless other officers to succeed in the most demanding assignments the military had to offer. His methods had been uncomfortable and stressful, but they had also been exactly what she needed to develop into the kind of leader who could thrive under any circumstances the Army might require. The colonel who had made her life so challenging had ultimately provided her with the greatest gift a mentor could offer, the knowledge and confidence necessary to exceed her own expectations and achieve success at levels she had never thought possible. The salute they exchanged that morning had marked not just the end of one assignment, but the beginning of a career distinguished by the principles and capabilities she had developed under his demanding but effective guidance.